Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, welcome to you all to this high-level panel on boosting opportunities for higher education in emergencies. I'm Ghida Fakhry, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you today and, of course, to serve as moderator for this session. As we meet on the margins of the summit on migrants and refugees, and of course you all know that just a couple of hours ago, the heads of state and government gathered at the General Assembly Hall have adopted a declaration that, quote, stresses that tertiary education maintains the hopes of students for the future and acts as a catalyst for recovery and post-conflict rebuilding. Now, of course, the salvation of higher education, you'll agree, doesn't just maintain the hopes of students for the future, but of entire communities and war-torn societies. Now, perhaps just a couple of quick points as we begin our session. Most of today's conflicts, I think you'll agree, start off as small crises. Looking around the room, I'm not sure how many of us would have predicted back in 2011 that Syria would be where it is today. I, for one, as a journalist covering the events quite closely, never would have expected it to look the way it does so many years on. So when then should the international community initiate emergency programs to rescue higher education for conflict-affected communities, especially when it has so many other challenges to deal with, and when the funds, resources, the level of support it can get for the more life-threatening, life-saving programs are at stake as well. And second, very importantly as well, and perhaps tying in with the previous point, funding. How do we make sure that member states, organizations can secure the funds that we need to work around the fact that donors are more likely to fund those urgent life-saving programs rather than education in general, let alone higher education? But with the world's attention on the issue of refugees today here at the UN, what needs to happen to push this part of the agenda forward? Essentially, what needs to happen? What concrete measures can we all discuss and implement in order to make sure that globally the 1% or even less than 1% of refugees have access to higher education? In a nutshell, how do we ensure that the loss of functioning education systems and institutions in affected areas doesn't also mean the loss of future generations of leadership? Many of the key players in this debate are in this room with us today, representatives of governments, civil society, foundations, non-governmental organizations, international agencies of the UN, aid agencies as well. We're also fortunate to have with us around the table as our keynote speaker, Antonio Guterres, who doesn't need any introduction. But first, to kick off our session, I'm pleased to give the floor to our first speaker and co-sponsor of this meeting, the Minister of State for Foreign Affairs of Qatar, Sultan bin Saad Al Muraikhi. And Minister, you have the floor, and dare I say the privilege as well to set the pace for our next speakers.
Thank you so much. أصحاب السعادة.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, may peace be upon you. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you on this high-level event on higher education in situation of emergency. I feel honored to take part in hosting this important event with His Excellency Augusto Souta Silva, the Foreign Minister of Portugal, with His Excellency Marcelo Mozales, the Acting Minister of Interior and Administrative Restructuring in Greece, and His Highness President Jorge Payo, and with the participation of establishments, bodies, and organizations of civil society, all of whom join us today. I would like to thank President Jorge Sampaio, who has devoted all his knowledge and experience, as well as his career in political and diplomatic charitable activities, in helping Syrian students in finding sustainable solutions. His objective has to provide higher education to the large number of Syrian refugees. Also, I would like to congratulate the international community who had worked to include a reference paragraph in the draft final document, by virtue of which the member of states would commit themselves for the first time in history to promote higher education. It says that high school education is very important for the recovery and reconstruction of post-conflict countries. In Article 21, Para 1, the International Declaration of Human Rights points to the need to provide equal access to higher education for all based on merit. This would apply to refugees and non-refugees on equal footing. However, the percentage of refugees who have access to higher education is less than 1%. Despite the fact that they have great potential and capabilities that can enable them to participate in economic development of their countries. The state of Qatar has encouraged the international community to do all it can to prevent the loss of whole generation of university graduates in conflict-afflicted countries, as in the case in Syria. We still call upon the international community to invest in the preparation of generation generation who will become future leaders. You are fully aware that most post-conflict countries suffer from the non-existence of a trained generation of qualified citizens capable of creating governance establishment. Such a generation plays an important role in enhancing peace and providing skills and qualifications. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we have to get rid of the causes preventing us from meeting the challenges faced by a generation of children and young men who have not had the chance to continue their education. The state of Qatar has made generous contributions earmarked for higher education in conflict-affected countries. We have supported many establishments and bodies of civil society inside and outside Qatar. In addition, universities in Qatar have opened their door and welcomed university students who were forced to leave Syria. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, enhancing higher education opportunities in a situation of emergency necessitate multiple partnerships and cooperation among stakeholders. The problem is so huge, and thus not a single country or university by itself can enhance higher education and learning for refugee students, and at the same time to meet the other challenges these students face. Hence, such a huge problem would require international cooperation at different levels and different dimensions. And I would like to tell you that the State of Qatar, in cooperation with the Development Fund of Qatar, will launch on Wednesday, 21 September 2016, an initiative called the Trust Fund of the State of Qatar to support the education of Syrian Quest. This includes a series of learnings and training programs aimed at covering the needs of Syrian youth inside Syria and those who have taken refuge in neighboring countries. The initiative seeks to upgrade their qualifications and giving them the chance to join official and non-official education establishments. And this initiative will help them to develop their skills that are required in competitive work markets. As one of its basic principles, the initiative aims at developing partnership between stakeholders, member states, the programs of the United Nations, agencies, and local international civil society organizations. In conclusion, I would like to appeal to member states, to universities, civil society, and to leading establishment to seize this opportunity and to pay more attention to education in situation of emergency and to form new partnerships based on providing long life education for refugee students. In fulfilling this task, we would finally be successful in creating productive and peaceful societies, leaving no one behind. Thank you very much for listening.
For this introduction and for giving us a real sense of why it is so important for governments in the region of conflict-affected areas to act, and perhaps stakeholders as well elsewhere to join forces with them. Our next speaker is the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Portugal, Augusto Santos Silva, whose government is also a co-sponsor of this meeting. And Portugal, Mr. Minister, has been at the very forefront of efforts being made currently to provide higher education opportunities for refugees. If you would, in 5 minutes or so, please give us a sense of why governments must act and double their efforts now.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. It is, of course, an honor to Portugal for Portugal to jointly organize this high-level event on the right to higher education opportunities in emergencies. And I do express appreciation for the thought-provoking approaches put forward by the fellow co-sponsors. And of course, I look forward to the distinguished keynote speakers and other panelists' presentations. Today's side event should provide an opportunity to reflect further on the right to higher education in emergency situations, a pivotal issue far too often ignored. Portugal supports the group of friends on the right to education in emergency situations under the most stable leadership of Qatar. And we believe that this group provides a good forum to champion further the right to education at all levels, including higher education in emergencies. Guaranteeing the right to education in emergency situations is one of Portugal's key priorities. It is indeed vital to alleviate the long-term effects of conflict, to achieve peaceful reconciliation and post-conflict reconstruction in conflict-ridden societies. Portugal has for many years now championed the right to education. Since 2001, first in the Human Rights Commission and from 2006 onwards in the Human Rights Council, Portugal has tabled a resolution on the right to education, always adopted by consensus. In emergency situations, children and young adults are among those who suffer the most, and the right to education of school children and university students is one of the first casualties of any given war or conflict. Indeed, education facilities are often used for military purposes and become themselves targets. And so Portugal sponsored the Lucent's guidelines for protecting schools and universities from military use from armed conflict. International humanitarian response for those who flee conflicts still overlooks the need to guarantee the right to quality education of school children and university students. The failure to guarantee the right to education in emergency situations deprives societies from the contribution of entire generations to recovery and reconciliation after periods of crisis and conflict. So I do wish to emphasize the importance of former President Jorge Sampaio's Global Platform for Syrian Students initiative, an example of a good practice that received Portugal's full support from the very outset. Thank you, President Sampaio, for this initiative. And concluding, this event will contribute to making the right to education in emergency situations, including higher education, a key issue in humanitarian responses. That is our common goal. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister, and thank you also for stressing the point that the failure to provide students with the support that they need today has long-term dire consequences for many of the countries that so desperately need the help. Now, Greece is also co-sponsoring this session. It has been directly, as we all know, affected by the Syrian conflict. We've all seen the images from the island of Lesbos, overwhelmed by the influx of refugees coming in from Turkey, trying to make their way into the EU zone. According to the International Rescue Committee, there are some 57,000 people now currently stranded within Greece. So how does the country even begin to focus on higher education? I give the floor now to the alternate Minister of Interior and Administrative Reconstruction of Greece, Yanis Moutzalis, to outline his government's position and vision for what more should be done and can be done under the circumstances.
Works now. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for being here and to transfer you what is happening in Greece and how it can be useful to take conclusions and to go in acts. First of all, I want to apologize. Probably I will be the only speaker that the translator must translate my English in English again. So I want you to accept it that and to suffer, but with dignity. The biggest refugees and immigrants flow after the Second War in Europe. You know that. For the most of them, the first entrance was from Greece. So in 8 months, 900,000 refugees and immigrants passed from Greece. And after that, more than about 60,000 are trapped because of the illegal closing of the borders in Greece. This happened together with the biggest economical crisis that ever happened in my country from the Second War. The 40% of them are childs, more than 20,000 childs. Now, from September, at those days, the schools are opening for those. And we think that until Christmas, all the childs will be in a pre-integration class in our schools. But looking at this, we see that 10% are in a higher education level. It means that 2,000 of them, potentially, they want and they can continue studying, even to the university, and 5% of them, it means 1,000, were already students before the war. My government with the European Council tried to make a laboratory to see what it happens. We create a summer school, we make a pilot program, and we have things and details to say that can be a solution. So we make a summer school. And probably also in other countries they try to work like this. After that, what? A winter school. And after that, a summer school. And after that, what? And meetings again, and meetings again. Something like public relations to say how important we are and how we try. Allowed me to be a little angry because I'm not in my office. I am usually in the field, and the field is something very hard. How we will go from laboratory work to real life? How we can give those potential students or students the future? It's difficult, and probably it cannot be happened this year. But this year we can be organized in this direction, to give them back their student life or to create the conditions under which they can do it. It's impossible for one country. It's not impossible only for my country. It's impossible for any country if we ask her alone to do it. Once again, so the problem is to share the problem, to resolve it. We cannot say again that we have to share the problem. We have to share, relocate the refugees. Usually in meetings like this, we say, okay, there is a European problem, there is a worldwide problem, we have to share it. And this is the best way to don't share the refugees. And there is no solution without sharing the refugees. We have to share, relocate the students in all Europe, even more, in universities worldwide. And Qatar said something about this. Probably a proposal, it could be that UNHCR must create offices in which refugees who want to continue their studies must be registered. And universities who can accept refugees to be enforced with scholarships to accept them. And this is a very hard work, but it has to be done. Once again, the only way to share the problem is to save the refugees in a fair and creative way. Don't let them feel useless, feel unfairly that we unfairly treat them. Don't let them be victims of radicalization. Let's integrate them. And when the war stops and they will be back in their countries, let them be a friendship bridge between our countries. Ladies and gentlemen, laboratory is a very good thing. Life is a better thing. We have to give solutions in life. Please, we have to share the refugees who have the right to continue to their education, and this can be done with the participation of all, not only with money, but giving positions in universities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Gonzalez. A lot of challenges, as you say, for those countries directly affected by the crisis involving the influx of refugees, and even for those who aren't so directly affected. And as you say, no one country can do it alone. A lot of interesting ideas that you've put forward that hopefully we'll be able to discuss later on with our panelists. It gives me pleasure now, though, to introduce the UN Secretary General's Special Advisor on the Summit on Addressing Large Movements of Migrants and Refugees, Karen Abu Zaid, an extremely busy person today with the summit going on here at the UN. She was previously Commissioner General of UNRWA and also worked for many years at UNHCR. Karen Abu Zaid, 1 million refugees, we all pretty much know the figures, have poured into the EU last year alone, yet, and it's interesting, you always say that we need to think of refugees in positive ways. We need to remind ourselves that it isn't a choice for them to be refugees. They don't choose to be labeled as such. Can the summit promote the idea of inclusion, tolerance? Are there any concrete solutions that you believe can be worked on? The floor is yours.
Well, I certainly hope so. I'm very grateful to the Ministers of State for Portugal and Qatar and the Minister for Greece for organizing this on higher education, because this is one of the things that we, as you've heard from everyone before me, is something that's very important and very specific that we can talk about of trying to achieve through this summit. Because when we're facing the mounting humanitarian needs, the questions about higher education are too often pushed to the margins of our discussion. This is something we can leave behind. When the New York Declaration was being adopted and negotiated, education was a high priority, and we achieved progress, I think, with its adoption today. States today have agreed to ensure that all children are receiving education within a few months of arrival and to prioritize budgetary allocations accordingly. It's the first time that we've established a time-bound goal for getting children into school. The Declaration also gives attention to higher education, saying that it serves as a powerful driver for change. And this is an acknowledgement that the benefits of higher education extend beyond the young people themselves. As the Declaration goes on to say, higher education acts as a catalyst for the recovery and rebuilding of post-conflict countries. We must think about recovering and rebuilding at an early stage, another point that's made in the document. Which generation of young people will return to Syria, for example? A generation of teachers and computer specialists, business leaders, engineers, nurses, a generation with knowledges and skills that will enable them to build their countries and their lives? Or will it be a generation of young people who've grown up without education and skills and hope? The future of peace and reconstruction depends on these children. It's short-term thinking not to invest in them. And for refugees who cannot return home in a foreseeable future or will not return, higher education is a valuable investment in the future of the countries that host them. Higher education is good for refugees, for host countries, and for the countries of origin. It's costly, yes, but today I think we'll hear some creative ideas about how higher education opportunities can be brought to more young refugee people, women and men. And I think the Minister of Qatar has already mentioned one of their initiatives. If we're able to give refugees hope for education by demonstrating political will, mobilizing resources, and opening educational opportunities in partnership with colleges and universities, then refugees will repay this investment. In this I have every confidence. And I think this, the important point about concentrating on higher education in my response to your question is that it is something that's very practical that we can say must happen, and you can think of how to do it rather than when we're talking about something more amorphous perhaps, such as human rights and other sorts of things. So it's education that we want to emphasize at all levels, and particularly in the context of this session of higher education. Thank you.
Very much, and also for outlining the fact and stressing the need to act early and quickly, and that, as you say, taking care of refugees and their education isn't just good for refugees themselves, but of their host nations as well. Now, of course, member states have to act individually, but collectively as well. They have to be supported, of course, by the right kinds of partnerships at the national, regional, and international levels. The strategic leadership role of the United Nations here obviously is quintessential. A former UN High Commissioner for Refugees, a former Prime Minister of Portugal, and possibly a future, many would say hopefully a future Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, is with us, and he is ideally placed to look at this issue from all these different various vantage points. Mr. Guterres, how do you see the challenge of providing higher education in emergencies?
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, let me congratulate those that have promoted this session, especially those that have been fighting to make sure that education, and higher education in particular, are included in the humanitarian international agenda. And you are really addressing a gap, a real gap, that is unfair for the aspirations of people, that is undermining the possibilities of reconstruction of countries, and that is also dangerous for the international community. Now, you will face many difficulties in implementing this declaration. The prevailing mood still is that a narrow approach to life-saving should prevail in emergency response. And it will be necessary to explain that this mood is wrong, and this mood should be corrected. There are, of course, many important initiatives already on the ground. I remember the education above all of Sheikh Moza. I would recall the Education Summit last year convened in Norway to put education in the agenda of humanitarian action. And of course, President Sampaio's initiative on the higher education for Syrian refugees, involving today 35 universities in 10 countries. But the truth is that if one looks at the investment in education in emergency situations compared with the global expenditure of those situations, we are still talking a very, very small percentage. And if one looks at the impact of it, namely in relation to refugee situations, the truth is that in the operations handled by UNHCR, and Volker Turk will correct me if I'm already out of the more actual information, but around 50% only of children had access to primary education, less than 1/3 to secondary education, and, as it was said, 1% to higher education. This shows really how neglected education has been in the priorities of fundraising and fund mobilization in humanitarian aid. Now, I must say, having been in many emergency situations, I understand, even for people on the ground, if you are in the border between South Sudan and Ethiopia and see tens of thousands of people coming in 1 month, hundreds of thousands in 1 year, you feel that what we need is to move the trucks, to pitch the tents, to find the water, distribute the food, vaccinate the children. But the point is that this logic is now becoming outdated for 2 reasons. First, because the logic that existed before, separating emergency situations from protracted situations, no longer makes sense. What we are having now is protracted emergencies. Situations that have the characteristics of an emergency, but that last for years and years and years without any meaningful change in the needs of humanitarian response. And second, because the idea that in responding to a crisis, humanitarians come first, address the humanitarian problems, and then as the situation stabilizes, they will tend to move out and the development actors come in in order to ensure reconstruction and stabilization, this again is no longer a reality. Now we have situations in which from the beginning it's absolutely essential to have development actors. We can no longer separate humanitarian aid from development cooperation. And if that is the case, education that some might neglect in a narrow-minded approach to life-saving in emergencies, education is the central pillar of any development project. And higher education is an absolutely crucial instrument for, first of all, the fulfillment of the aspirations of people. Second, the possibilities of reconstruction of the countries. And as Karen Abu Zaid was saying, how many engineers, how many professors, how many doctors, how many nurses will Syria need to reconstruct, to rebuild itself after, hopefully, the war ends. But at the same time, it is also a question related to global security. We cannot afford to have young people that conclude secondary education that do not find any chance to have both higher education and jobs. And someone was saying here in a UN meeting some months ago, let's not forget that the idle minds are the devil's playground. And the frustration of a large number, and we are now talking of millions of people, the frustration of large number of young people that can't find any chance to go on in their education or to find an adequate job, that frustration is an excellent element for those that are building today a real threat of terrorism in the world, to be able to recruit, to be able to find new members of their organizations, and to be able to put into question not only the situation of the areas in crisis, but the collective security of the international community. So I think it's high time to understand that to have education as a first priority in this humanitarian development combined approach, and to have higher education as a central pillar for fulfilling aspirations, creating conditions for reconstruction, and ensuring international security are two things that the international community must understand, and more than understand, are two things that international actors must accept, making sure that what was approved in this declaration is effectively implemented on the ground.
Mr. Guterres, thanks very much for this and for making sure that to let all of us here know, all the different stakeholders in this debate, that education need not be seen as a luxury or an afterthought in cases of emergencies. And I hope that as keynote speaker, you'll allow me to ask you a couple of quick follow-up questions. You mentioned that the old logic of putting first life-saving emergencies, essentially giving shelter, food, water, security as well to refugees, no longer has to be taken separately from the overall issue of education as well, which goes towards the rebuilding and reconstruction of these war-torn countries. How realistic, though, how practical is this viewpoint? Because higher education requires some kind of predictability, some kind of rather complex sets of infrastructure. How do you square this off with the unpredictability of refugee crises and the flow of refugees?
Things are unpredictable. But there is one thing that we can predict, is that crisis will last. I mean, if you look at the crisis we are facing today, Syria, it has been there for 5 years, and it will go on, probably. Afghanistan, it has been there for, I would say, yes, but I mean, since the 70s, 40 or 50 years. Somalia, more than 20 years. Democratic Republic of Congo, more than 20 years. And you can go on and on and on. So crises will last, and recoveries will be slow. If that is the case, not to have education since the beginning as a priority, and not to include higher education in that approach, that global approach to education, is, I think, a suicide. And what we are seeing in some of the situations I lived with in UNHCR is an enormous frustration of young people that stay in refugee camps for years and years and years and have no chance either to complete their education or to find a job or any other form of integration in the society. This kind of ghettification of young people in today's world in protracted emergencies is, I think, something totally unacceptable from their point of view, but it's also, I think, a danger for us all.
And I think the key here is to secure the funding, though, for these types of endeavors. Now, if the influx into the EU provoked such a political dissent last year and political divisions among EU member states, how can we really expect EU governments or others, wealthy governments, to devote enough attention, let alone enough resources, to bring higher education to refugees? And I was struck by a statement you made last year in Washington, where you said that the refugee problem has not become all of a sudden more dramatic. And I quote, "What has changed is that refugees for the first time are coming in big numbers to the rich world, and that there is that false idea, you say, in Europe, that it is being invaded." I mean, how do you counter, how do you change this narrative in order to make everything that we're talking about here today happen?
Well, I think, first of all, there are things that are a matter of fact. We had last year in Europe about a little bit more than 1 million people coming by the sea, not all refugees. Many were migrants also aspiring to come into Europe. If you compare 1 million with the population of the European Union, we are talking about less than 2%. Now, in Lebanon, we have 1 refugee for each 3 Lebanese. So let's be clear. We are talking about a problem that is serious, whose dimension is big, but it should be manageable if the European Union would be able, together with member states, to organize themselves in order to, first of all, prevent, to the extent possible, this kind of movement, and that has to do with peace negotiations in Syria, that has to do to the support to the countries of first asylum, to many other things that are not being done sufficiently. But then, when a flow comes in, to organize the reception, the registration, the screening, and the distribution in a, I would say, acceptable way and fair way in relation to all European countries. If a country like mine, Portugal, would receive proportionally to our dimension, our economy and our population, it would mean receiving 20 to 30,000 people. This would be perfectly manageable for a country like Portugal. But instead of this kind of organized reception, screening, distribution, what we had was this movement across the Balkans, looking like something that nobody was in charge, nobody was able to control, and that many felt that was a kind of invasion that would undermine I would say, the identity of their societies or whatever. So it is true, in my opinion, that this could have been managed, and this we shouldn't be having today the impact that we had in many public opinions that are now totally against refugees, migrants, foreigners, etc. But having said so, there is one thing that is clear. If some countries in the north do think that they cannot receive a large number of refugees, then there is no other way but to massively invest in, first of all, addressing the crisis to solve them, and second, supporting effectively the countries of first asylum, namely allowing them to not only guarantee to the refugees but also to host communities the access to education, to health, to jobs, to many other aspects that will allow people to live in harmony and not to feel forced to move onwards in order to guarantee the minimum to which they aspire in life. What we cannot have is closed borders and no dramatic increase in development cooperation and humanitarian aid to the areas in crisis.
And following up on this thought, and as Minister Musalis mentioned earlier, should countries, universities in certain countries take specific measures perhaps in offering a number of scholarships per year for qualified refugees? What are your thoughts on that?
There are already several initiatives in relation to this. There is a program sponsored by Germany, the DAFI program, which corresponds to this 1% that I have mentioned, but of course it's 1%. There is the initiative that I also mentioned in which 35 universities are now receiving Syrian refugees. I think this should be a common practice, and there should be student visas easily given to make it happen in a I would say, normal way. And governments, together with universities and the civil societies, should organize themselves in order to guarantee that those that are a vital component of these moving communities that are facing this crisis could have the expression of international solidarity that would allow them to, as I said, feel themselves fulfilled in their aspirations, but at the same time to be able to contribute in the future for their countries, and also not to feel the enormous frustration of being abandoned when the motto of the international community is not to leave anyone behind.
But just briefly, in order to have a more coherent approach, should UN agencies, specialized agencies, perhaps UNESCO, UNHCR, set up a specific fund to help students in these cases?
I think that the problem is not to have a fund, because sometimes you have a fund and then the fund is unfunded and then you don't solve the problem. I think the problem is to establish mechanisms of coordination between all the actors, governments, host governments of countries of origin whenever that is meaningful, but host countries and governments in donor countries, UN agencies, the civil society. There are several NGOs that have played a crucial role in education, and that, of course, should be recognized and should be promoted. Universities, and to try to have a concerted action, and then to make sure that those programs would be adequately funded.
And we will, forgive me to interrupt you, we'll be hearing from these NGOs in a few minutes, but perhaps just ending on this note, you mentioned earlier in the European context, but in the wider context as well, that governments should come together to prevent crises in the first place. So I wonder, as a prospective Secretary General of the UN yourself, do you think, and I must ask you this, I mean, do you think that the dramatic increase of refugees and IDPs around the world has to do, to a certain extent, with the failure of the UN, the Security Council, to prevent and address some of these crises in the first instance?
I'd like first to clarify that I'm strictly here in my capacity of former High Commissioner for Refugees.
But would you say that the UN can do more, though?
Portuguese delegation.
But
I would like to say one thing about this, and that is, I feel, clear. The international community has spent much more resources, time, and energy in managing crises than in preventing them. And prevention is something that is very difficult to put in place. First of all, because there is no attention to prevention. There are no cameras filming when a crisis is prevented. The cameras are there when the crisis erupts. And so there is funding to respond to the crisis, but sometimes there is no funding for those programs that are necessary in order to guarantee that society is developed in a way that is harmonious, that is fair, and that avoids this kind of situations. But one of the things that I believe needs to dramatically change in the priorities of the international community is the focus on prevention. And it's not only prevention of crisis. It is prevention also, and I'm very happy with the Paris Agreement, in relation to moving into preventing climate change to become an engine of tragedies, one after the other, is the prevention in all other aspects related to peace, security, development, human rights, in which a concerted effort in prevention can be, first of all, a huge source of stability for us all, of development for the world, but also it is much cheaper to prevent than to respond to this dramatic crisis. For those that selfishly look only at the material dimension of things, it's really better to prevent than to respond.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gutierrez, and many thanks again to all of our distinguished speakers in this opening session. Our next segment now looks at the rapid response mechanism for higher education in emergencies to make sure that this whole process is dealt with efficiently from the very beginning. And while I ask our next set of panelists to join me at the head table for our discussion on this and other issues relating to higher education in emergencies, let's take a look now at what rapid response and its mechanism is all about. And let me just say that it is
in 2015, 65.3 million people, or one person in 113, were displaced from their homes due to conflict and persecution or because of natural disasters. Regretfully, war, not peace, has momentum, and since 2010, each year has seen more conflict, more victims, and more people displaced. With more than 35 conflicts going on, the situation will not stop or be reversed soon. Among refugees, 51% are young people who are less than 18 years old. The average time they stay in a camp is 17 years. Providing refugees and displaced people with life-saving aid is a moral duty and an international obligation. But there's more than that. Ask parents in refugee camps what they want for their children. They all seek the same thing first: education. In emergency situations, education at all levels matters. Education makes a real difference. Most parents' dream is that their children go to university. The same goes for young people. And yet, higher education is too often neglected. Only 1% of refugees have access to higher education. The others are left behind, vulnerable, hopeless. What a waste. We have to turn this tide. How can we do more, better, and faster? As hospitals have emergency services, education should also have emergency programs. So let's set up a rapid response mechanism for higher education in emergencies. No need to reinvent the wheel. Universities are used to hosting foreign students and scholars to exchange programs and mobility. So let's put them at the center of a rapid response mechanism. Integrating refugees and other forcibly displaced students is not that fundamentally different from integrating any other student. Now, to make it work in emergencies, we need to remove barriers that refugees face to accessing higher education, including lack of information, advice, and individual guidance sensitive to their specific needs. To address these issues, we need to set up a coordination facility, a combination of online state-of-the-art solutions and tools, plus a small team able to manage, coordinate, and provide an effective emergency academic response. And indeed, we need a financing facility. For that, we have to bring together some donors who will make an endowment, and we can raise a solidarity levy within the global academic community. If each student gives $1, we will make more than $230 million per year. That's it. Our rapid response mechanism is working now. We can do more, better, and faster. What a difference. Let's make education become a true catalyst for recovery. Let's prepare a new generation of leaders who will be responsible for rebuilding war-torn countries. The great Einstein, he too was a refugee. Let's follow in his footsteps. Let's build hope for the future. Together, we can make it happen.
Which I was saying earlier, is the result of a brainstorming set of sessions culminating here in New York last February, sponsored by the Global Platform for Syrian Students and the Institute for International Education. So with the constant flow of refugees and migrants around the world, the growing demand for resources and support, how prominently does higher education feature on the list of priorities? We'll be looking at this question with our panelists who are joining me here at the head table. Volker Turk is Assistant High Commissioner for Protection at UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. What is your immediate priority? When you look at this and you take the wider context of the survival of refugees, food, water, shelter, security, we've been talking about this earlier, education taking a distant backseat or not, perhaps, as Mr. Guterres was suggesting, it shouldn't. UNHCR, having launched a strategy for higher education a few years ago, how much of a difference has it made, and what more can be done?
Well, thank you very much. I think, first of all, it's great that there is this focus on education also here on the sides of this Leaders Summit for refugees and migrants. It's extremely important, as my former boss, the former High Commissioner, was saying, that indeed it is seen as part and parcel of the emergency response early on. We have seen an increase in resources, albeit not to the level where indeed it is required. I mean, the Dafi program was mentioned. For instance, last year we had 6,000 students who were enrolled in higher education in about 40 countries. We have also done a lot of more work on digital learning and in connecting universities in the world to ensure that they can actually conduct courses in various refugee operations around the world, which is very important. But just perhaps to go back to the New York Declaration, because it is quite an amazing thing that happened today. We have a New York Declaration that puts forward international solidarity and provides, if you like, the nuts and bolts of how the international community in the future is going to engage with countries that are affected by large-scale influxes. And education is mentioned. What is also mentioned is a whole-of-society approach. It means that refugee issues cannot just be addressed by member states. They need to be addressed by civil society, by host communities. And that also talks to universities themselves. So the universities are actors in in and of themselves that will need to open up and find ways and means to understand what refugees sometimes went through. For instance, they may not have the documentation that is required in order to be able to access some of the education programs. We know that a number of universities around the world have actually looked at trying to limit some of the requirements. And I think that's one of the calls that we will need to make to implement and to rise to the challenge of implementing the New York Declaration on Education.
And as you mentioned, the New York Declaration is the very declaration that was adopted at the United Nations today. As you say, yes, it does mention the importance of higher education, but does it mention it forcefully enough, do you think? And does it put forward concrete enough ideas that can be pursued?
I think it's upon all of us to have a very careful look at the language, to combine some of the elements, I mean, education and, as I was mentioning, whole of society approach, the fact that development funding has to come in much earlier, that host communities have to be involved much earlier, to recognize also that education is the social space that allows for people like employment to get along, to interact with host communities. That's where the interaction that takes place. It's in schools, it's at universities, and that social space of interaction is what we need to foster more.
But can this physical social space that you talk about, which has its own set of obstacles, we talked about the language, cultural barriers, the lack of documentation, can that be diminished, mitigated in a way if we expanded the space for learning to the online virtual world in a much more significant way? Would that make sense from a financial perspective as well?
We have a connected learning consortium for higher education for refugees. We started this initiative precisely because we wanted to learn and expand it in this way. But we also have seen a couple of examples of universities that have opened themselves up to refugees. Both, I mean, I was in my own country in Austria, in Graz, at the University of Graz. They went through all the various regulations and decrees and were trying to see, so how do we deal with the refugee reality? How can we make language courses available free of charge, ensure that integration takes place? Then I was in Nigeria earlier this year, in Adamawa State, Yola. You have the American University there. And again, it's the American University. You have a lot of internally displaced people in Adamawa State, in the northeast of Nigeria. And they open themselves up to the various internally displaced who want to get access to higher education. And they became an actor. They became almost like a combination of a humanitarian and a development actor, realizing that they have a social role to fulfill in this exercise. And I think this realization we need to work on much more, using the New York Declaration for that purpose.
Thank you, Volker Turk. Let me now turn to John Ging, the Director of the Operations Division at the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA. John Ging also served as Director of UNRWA in Gaza for many years. Your daily job seems to me like the job of a fireman, essentially going from one flashpoint to the next, and quite often not with enough resources, or at least not as much as you might want to have. Under these circumstances, what do you think is the best course of action to expand the opportunities for higher education in emergency situations?
Thank you. I think, simply put, it's about changing our mindset. This is in our collective self-interest. Yes, indeed, the victims of a deficit of political humanity, for want of a better term, are denied the opportunity of achieving their potential. But as Mr. Guterres said, we have to adjust ourselves to the way the world is, and we can't, wait for things to fall into a convenient sequence. We have to do what we have to do, dealing with that reality in a way that gives people the prospect of having a life beyond their current circumstances, rather than celebrating just keeping them alive. So what people are appealing to us on a daily basis across this globe, who are the victims of an ever-growing inhumanity, is that we need to help them beyond keeping them alive. And this goes to the heart of this discussion today, and it's great that we're having this discussion today.
And of course, we tend to focus on Syria, but there are so many forgotten, should I say, refugees, generation upon generation of refugees who are still there and very much count on the UN and its member states to help. The Syrian crisis in its 6th year already, one has the feeling, though, that it's only just entered the moral consciousness of the world. To what extent, though, do you think that this attention on Syria is to the detriment of older refugees?
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, politically and in the media, certain crises will get the attention of the day, but institutionally, we are all, obliged to look at the totality of the landscape that we have responsibility to help. So we're not following the media focus institutionally, whether it's in the United Nations or other organisations, and in member states who are generous donors. Also, I mean, we have programming, we have multi-annual approaches, and so forth. But the real issue here is that we're not connecting our wealth, our global wealth, and looking at addressing these issues in a much longer-term perspective, because investment now in the framework of 20 or 30 years looks like good value for money. Investment that is required now for that impact over the next 10, 20, 30 years is massive in the short term. But we are not learning that lesson that repeatedly short-term approaches to long-term problems actually don't work. They're both more expensive financially, and of course they are not effective in terms of the objective of giving people both the support and assistance that they need to survive a crisis, but also to come through that and have a life beyond it.
And as you say, there's also the sense of detachment that many of the wealthier countries who can contribute have to certain crises. I mean, many in the West will say that the refugee crisis in Syria should best be dealt by countries in the region. Now, we all know that Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey have taken in their fair share of refugees, 2.2 in the case of Turkey. My own country, Lebanon, 1.5, which is a quarter of the population in Lebanon. Jordan, more than 600,000, I believe. Can they and should they be doing more, the countries in the region?
The countries in the region, when it comes to the Syria crisis, they give us the example of what everybody should be doing. So they are disproportionately shouldering an international responsibility to help the people of Syria, who are the victims of a terrible conflict. What is shameful is that the rest of the rich world is not doing anything even remotely proportional to what the neighbouring countries are doing. And were they to do that, then we would have a situation where at least the people who fled the conflict would be getting the education that they required, the dignity, the livelihood prospects, and so on and so forth. So they would be able to live a dignified life and have a prospect for their children of a better life beyond the conflict that they have just fled, and then be in a much better position to return to Syria when that conflict comes to an end, to rebuild their own country, which is what the overwhelming vast majority of the people wish to do, is to go home.
Specifically and very briefly, though, what concrete measures are you looking for?
Well, the issue that we're focusing on today is what can be done in higher education. So there needs to be more focus on, first and foremost, in conflict situations, not destroying all the third-level institutions. There's an orgy of violence going on in the world today where there's just massive infrastructure destruction, and when you destroy education facilities, you are having a devastating impact on the future, for sure. When you have a conflict situation, again, practically speaking, we need a greater mobilisation of the good practice and the great example of many universities across the world who reach out and offer scholarships. Let's actually set targets on this and make this standard practice, not best practice. Link up universities with universities in developing countries. Again, we have a lot of good practice on that, but we need to make it standard practice. And of course, focus on academic staff. Academic staff, teachers, lecturers, these are the key. Even more important than infrastructure, the staff themselves. And get it into our minds, by the way, that you can educate during a crisis, during a conflict, Personally, when I was in the Gaza Strip for many years, the best achieving schools in the Gaza Strip were in the areas that were most affected by the worst of the conflict. And of course, I don't want anybody to draw a conclusion that conflict is good for academic standards. No, what the key revelation for everybody was that the best teachers happened to be in those schools. So again, I can't overemphasize the importance of focusing on academic staff.
And we will speak directly to this point with our next panelist, who has experience in dealing with scholarship and education programs in Gaza. But first, I want to turn to Alan Goodman, who is president and CEO of the Institute of International Education. And the point that John Ging made just moments ago fits very well with what I'd like to ask you, even though I intended to just take a little pause and ask for your thoughts after what we've heard so far. But perhaps you can also let us know what you think can be done to increase the number of scholarships that are provided by US and EU universities.
Thank you, and thanks for all the statements that have been made and terrific questions that you're asking all the panelists. There are 15,000 institutions of higher education in the world. Every one of them should take one refugee or displaced student, maybe two. And since we think there are about 150,000 Syrians alone that haven't been able to resume their education, it would be a good start, and we would learn a lot by what it means to take those students in. It's an old lesson. We need to relearn in higher education, and as you'll hear from the students that will speak in a few minutes, refugee students and displaced students make really great students. They thrive. They take advantage of the opportunity in the way that many American and European university students don't. So we have to get back in the game we played in after World War II, but in much bigger scale on a global basis.
Is it realistic, though? I mean, it's a wonderful idea to come to a scenario where every university in the US and elsewhere takes in just one qualified refugee per year. Is it realistic, though? And how do you entice some of these wealthy universities to do so and to not just enroll students, but support the full education cycle of at least one student per year?
Thanks to the Carnegie Corporation of New York, we've had a few opportunities to experiment with this and calls for scholarships. We have now 280 universities in America that have said we will take at least one Syrian student. But every time we make a call for applications, we get thousands of applications, and not just from Syria. So the scale is really huge. And I think by doing what we're doing today in America, through Germany and its program in Europe, in Portugal, we will learn what it takes to get the other universities to open their doors and realize that this is part of building peace. It's part of rebuilding a country, but it's also making sure we don't have a lost generation of people that become recruits for ISIS.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goodman. Let me now perhaps turn to Fahad Sulaiti, who is the CEO of the Qatar-based Education Above All Foundation, an initiative which was launched back in 2012 by Sheikha Moza bint Nasser. John King was just alluding earlier to the experience that education programs have had and the impact they've had on the population in Gaza, sometimes producing some of the best academic results. How has your experience of providing education programs, or at least contributing to 35 education programs in Gaza alone, and bringing education to some 600 children, how does that enrich our discussion of how to provide higher education in conflict situations?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you and to thank our excellencies here for sharing their challenges. I agree with Mr. Antonio Guterres today. The worse than lack of fund is lack of joint visions. Okay, and this is what's really missing in Gaza and in Syria today. And this is something very, very, very important. What we have been learned through our journey there, the money is not enough to fulfill our obligation to provide every child and youth the right to the education that they deserved. Without protection and prevention, what we spend years building can be destroyed in a minute. And this is really what's happened in 2014. 90% of our investment there been destroyed in Gaza. However, we have recently working in reconstruction there for investment for $40 million, again to reconstruct what have been destroyed in 2004. What we are doing now today is expanding this program from Palestine to Syria and give an opportunity for 2,800 scholarship for higher education and 14,000 for opportunity for youth and vocational training.
You mentioned the lack of funds, and you also say that money isn't enough. But wealthy countries in the Gulf region are often criticized, sometimes harshly criticized, for not doing enough, for not taking many refugees. I wonder if you can tell us what Gulf countries, and I'm thinking more specifically universities in the Gulf, are doing to offer scholarships. I lived in Doha for a couple of years, and I remember going touring the education city and being highly impressed by the Ivy League campuses that are there, and never seem to be overcrowded. I just wonder, is there room for more refugees in some of these universities, and certainly room for more scholarships?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think I just mentioned that with the new expansion of Al-Fakhura, working with refugees, for Syrian refugees, we are working now with Qatar universities and Hamad bin Khalifa University to host around 20 Syrian refugees, 10 in Qatar University and 10 in Hamad bin Khalifa University inside Qatar Foundation. So this is the capacity for this upcoming 2 years. Now we are working on it. I don't know about the region, about the rest. I know about Qatar and what we are doing, through Al-Fakhura program.
Do you think that the region should do more as a whole?
I agree with you. I think yes, and I believe that we need to give a window for all this youth, to have their opportunities, not only for higher education, but to empower them for economic and training, and this is something very important, to get a job at the end.
And I know that you also emphasize a lot civic education and civic leadership for those refugees, with the hopes that they will one day return home and participate in the rebuilding of their societies, which now leads me then to call on two students or former students who are with us here in the room. Noor Dawood, one of the first Jusur Scholarship recipients from Syria, also a scholarship recipient to Germany, currently a software engineer at Goldman Sachs. I don't know, Noor, how much you fit the definition of a refugee. I do know that your education was interrupted by the events in Syria. And for any student, I imagine that going through this whole upheaval within your country and having to leave and flee the violence and all of a sudden becoming a refugee, quote unquote, is traumatic enough. What was the experience like for you, and how important was higher education when there were so many other issues for you to deal with?
Yeah, so basically about a year before everything got really bad, so I couldn't go to school anymore because it was just pretty much impossible to get there. I was in my 4th year. So I was also top of my class at the time. I was studying computer and communications. So for me, it was very frustrating to think that I might lose pretty much everything. So I was just researching scholarships all the time. And then I ended up finding one to the U.S. So I didn't come here as a refugee. I came here as a student. But I definitely understand how every Syrian refugee feels, or every Syrian student who is in danger of losing their education feels right now. I think that Syrians are very hardworking. When I came to the U.S., I was not scared of whether I can make it or not in school, because I knew that it wasn't an option for me to fail. So I just knew that, okay, I have to graduate, I have to work. And then once I got my internship and I started my job, I was able to help my family. So it's not just about, obviously we want to rebuild our country. This is definitely our goal, but also in immediate terms, we are also helping our families back home. We are helping educate the rest of our families when we come here and get educated. We are also, we do a really good job in the companies that we get to. I was only one of many other students that came to the U.S. as part of Jusur, which is an organization. It was started by Syrians outside of Syria to help Syrians inside Syria to get their education. And pretty much everyone else who got the scholarship was able to do something. Many of us, like for example, examples of companies are Apple, Google, and many others. So yeah, I think that everyone who gets here is really willing to work really hard on themselves. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Noor.
Yeah,
I hate to
sure.
interrupt you. Is there anything else that you wanted to add briefly? Because I do have to move to some of our next speakers, but we do want to hear
I
from
just
you,
wanted
of
to
course.
mention that we deal with a lot of context switching on a daily basis because we have to follow everything that is going on back home, and we still need to do a great job in school and a great job in our jobs. And regardless of all of this, we still want to work hard, so I would really like everyone who is here to it's really great to see that everyone understands that we do need more scholarships, but we would also see, we would like to see that happening as well on the ground.
It's great to have you here and to obviously see you as an example of what education can do when you're able to pursue the right opportunities. Mustafa Ibrahim, I'm not sure if he is with us, he is a scholar who's a refugee from Iraq. He was supported by the Scholar Rescue Fund. And I just wanted to briefly touch with you on the point, if I could, of the importance of engaging in higher education or continuing to be a scholar, such as in your case, with the view of coming back to your country after the war, after the conflict has ended, to contribute. What is the likelihood for you and others in your position to go back to their countries and contribute in that sense?
Thank you. When I came the first time, someone asked me, what do you find here in the United States? I told him I got it civilization, a great civilization. Because my major is urban and regional planning, city planning, so almost the cities has lack of infrastructure, and we have 3-4 provinces under ISIS. One of them until now is Nainawa under ISIS. And we have 3-4 cities, Tikrit, Ramadi, Fallujah, destroyed, almost 19% destroyed, because I am in contact with my colleagues in Iraq. And someone visited me, and we stayed to contact with them. I hope one day I will come back to my country, and I transfer this experience to my country, how we can rebuilding, reconstruction, my country, my physical, and focus on education, because I was faculty in Baghdad University. So I spent 2 years with the Trinity College. And so I have 2 sides in my experience, applied side and academic side.
Mustafa, thank you very much. I'm sorry we're being pressed for time. So thank you for sharing with us your experience. If I can quickly move with very brief comments to our next set of NGO speakers who I know are here in the room with me before we actually wrap up with President Sampaio and also the representative with us here, Pierre Kernbull of UNRWA. Just very briefly, Sally Ward, I think you are here, there you are, a regional manager for higher education in the Middle East and North Africa at the British Council. Your approach is very much indigenous, helping indigenous education and education systems thrive. Tell us a little bit more about your initiatives, in a nutshell or two.
The work that we're doing is very much centered in the Middle East and North Africa region. And although scholarships are important for some students, we mustn't forget the many students who are perhaps not top of their class, who are in host countries, and who really need to find a way to make their dreams or to find a way to realize their potential. So what we do is we provide, through a number of projects, English language and other language support for students, and then we help those students to make to go into various educational pathways, both through online learning, which is accredited, and through non-accredited courses. We also are part of the HOPES project, which runs right across the region, which also provides a number of education opportunities, such as scholarships, education counselling, and language support for higher education students in the regions, particularly in the host countries, in all 5 host countries. And we do that in partnership with DARD, Campus France, and NUFIC.
Thank you so much, Sally. for giving us a sense of what you do and the projects that you've embarked on in the region. Nina Lemons, you mentioned the German Academic Exchange Service. She is with them. Nina, tell us basically, if you would, how you deal with the challenge of language, barriers and so on, and what is the criteria really in selecting some of these refugees?
If you allow me, I would like to say that, that in Germany there's already a lot going on, and that Germany in fact has pledged a lot of money for helping students, refugee students. Just to give you a few numbers, there's more than 1 million refugees who have arrived in Germany last year, and there will be more than 350,000 coming this year. So we really have a big number. And out of these, we reckon that about 30 to 50,000 could be going to universities or continuing with their university education. So you see, we have a really big number of people there. That's like 1 or 2 big major universities that we could fill with the refugees. And like you have said, there are certain hurdles that have to be overcome, like the criteria, like seeing what the documentation they have, where they are in their education, where they have been, if they have had certain language training. And as we are pressed for time, I would just like to say that our programs could maybe act as best practice examples, because we have a 4-step approach to this crisis, and Germany has by now pledged more than 100 million euros, Germany alone, on the federal level. And just 2 days ago, one of our federal Länder has pledged 30 million per year more to help refugee students. So there is a lot going on in Germany, and also some of this money is used in the neighboring countries in the region. But if you have any interest in seeing what we're doing, we have given you a handout and you can read a little bit more about this.
Thank you so much, Nina. Much more to be said. As you say, Germany doing so much for refugees within Europe, and we all know the heavy price, political price, that Angela Merkel is paying for her principled stance. A different issue, but goes to show the level of pressures that are on some of these countries to do more for refugees. Quickly on to Chris Eaton, who is the Executive Director of the World University Service Canada, which is a leading NGO that provides education opportunities for disadvantaged youth around the world. Tell us a little bit why your scheme is working, policy, immigration plans that go hand in hand, that allow private organizations to raise funds for refugees, and also that gets civic society working on this as well.
So I think the unique aspect of the Canadian context is that a lot of refugees come to Canada through private sponsorship. Canadians themselves and institutions sponsoring people to come to Canada and become refugees, landed immigrants, and then Canadian citizens. My organization organizes the post-secondary education community's response to refugee crises, and has done for the last 30 years. And it does that through a peer-to-peer model of students sponsoring students and supporting them in terms of their integration on campus and in Canadian society. And they do that by raising the money themselves, and largely this is done by student levies that are on various campuses that students get passed through referenda, and other students then agree to fund students, refugee students in that respect. And then they help to bring the whole community together in responding to the needs of students who are on campus. I would say that international students, although similar to refugee students sometimes need a whole lot more support. And that's best done, I think, through these peer-to-peer networks that we help to establish on campuses themselves. The last aspect of this that I think is really important is the durability of the solution. This is an ongoing program. It's an expanding program, and it's a program that allows people to certainly contribute back to their countries when they are able to do so, but to do so from a very safe base of being Canadian citizens. So they come to Canada, they're Canadian citizens, they get their education, they integrate seamlessly into Canadian society because of the education that they receive, and then often when the opportunity is right, they contribute back to their home society.
Thank you very much indeed, as you say, incentivizing the whole issue for universities as well. in order to play their part. I just want to very quickly now go to our closing remarks and first give the floor to Pierre Krahenbuhl, Commissioner General of UNRWA since 2014. In a way, many would say that you have it easy, that you are dealing with a refugee crisis that's been going on for about 60 years. What are the lessons learned, and how can we move forward on providing opportunities for refugees in the wider context?
Thank you so much, and it really is an honor to join you here. And I think one of the first things that comes to mind when listening to the many comments we hear in many of the discussions today in Hall is when conflict starts and sets in, one of the first things one can imagine that is actually given up on is education. The first thing that comes to mind is the delivery of aid, the delivery of medical assistance. But in most places, one doesn't imagine that education can be preserved in situations of conflict. And one of the things that impressed me most since joining UNRWA, to be very frank, is this combination of an organization that invests in the life-saving assistance in critical moments, the Gaza conflict, the Syria war presently, but that does not abandon and give up on the investment in human beings as actors of their own destiny. That's what we do through education. 700 schools for 500,000 boys and girls in Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, the West Bank and Gaza is an investment in preserving the capacity and the opportunities for young children for the future. And the link, of course, to higher education is particularly important because without the basis of the education that is provided in our primary and secondary school environments, of course, there is no access to higher education. So that inclusive, qualitative education basis has to be made and preserved and maintained. Now, in the very unstable Middle East, it also means that when you invest in education, you preserve a certain base of opportunity and hope for young people. The political horizon is closed for the moment. Very many young people don't know what to do with their future. Whenever I walk into an UNRWA classroom, the first thing that I'm struck by is, of course, the pride that we actually have education going on for these young children. But I also look at them and remember every time that when they leave their 9 years or 10 years of education, where are they going? Which job opportunities are they going to get in Gaza, where the horizon is closed? In Syria, where the landscape has been devastated in terms of employment, and in Lebanon, where the difficulties for Palestinians to have access to employment are well known. So, of course, it is this connection between what we do in terms of investment for education at a primary and secondary level, the link to higher education, but also the investment into technical, vocational, educational training, because it is very essential to create that link between education and employment as a factor of stability for the region.
Pierre Krahenbuhl, thank you very much for being brief and for talking to us about the importance of providing, as you say, that continuum and making sure that the lucky few who do get access to higher education come home and contribute when the time is right. My honor now is to give the final word to the chairman of the Global Platform for Syrian Refugees, President Sampaio.
No, just a moment, if it's possible to give Mr. Shah 2 bullets, peaceful bullets, because
and you're absolutely right, and I intended to, we were just rushed, but Mr. Shah, if I can just briefly introduce you. You are representing United Kingdom universities. Tell us what they are doing and what more they can do.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will stick to only 2 points. I represent a university membership organisation. The reason why we wanted to be here was that we recognise the inherent good of education in transforming lives, but also in people like Noor and Mustafa creating the future rebuilders of countries affected by conflict. But also as charities, as public good institutions, we see human capital as the asset that a people displaced from their country have. To lose for a generation the hope of higher education is a loss and a risk for them, but it is also, in a globally connected world, a loss and a risk to us. The second point is that we do international higher education. We have a quarter of our staff from countries around the world. We educate more than 600,000 students through partnerships outside of our country, more than we welcome to our country. As universities, we do a lot individually. We host scholars, we fund our own scholarships. Increasingly, we partner overseas. I think that I welcome the inclusion of higher education in the declaration. I welcome the points from John and Volker that collaborating with those institutions in host countries is the way that we can make the greatest difference, and I look forward to the coordinating and the funding facilities.
Daniel Shah, thanks very much. Do you have a figure, though, for how many universities, how many scholarships in the UK? Thank you so much. Assistant Director for Policy at Universities UK, did not mean to put you on the spot. And thanks very much for your contribution. Now, finally, once more to our final speaker, the chairman of the Global Platform for Syrian Refugees, former president of the Portuguese Republic.
Thank you very much. Very quickly, because so many important things have been said today. May I thank the organizers. May I thank all those who were in the panels this morning with very stimulating interventions. I just wanted to say a very modest proposal, which is twofold, really. The firstly is to set up within the United Nations system a kind of a group of friends, bringing together like-minded partners, states, international organizations, but also some organizations from civil society and, of course, the academic community, willing to lead the way and open up new avenues for cooperation. What is the second point? The second is to create a small task force to work out the details of a full proposal to set up a rapid response mechanism for higher education in emergencies. We went through a very long process to have this damn word of higher education in the document. I mean, I'm not going to go through that. I mean, it's amazing that it took so long to admit that 1% of Syrians are really the only ones who, or refugees getting to universities, when if you want alternatives for the future, you need people prepared to teach others the primary school. Who on earth is going to teach primary school if no one has a graduate from so on? So I'm very in accordance with John Ding when he said, well, I remember him in Gaza. It's an unforgettable visit. But he said today that we simply have to carry on what has to be done. And I totally agree. And why? We are not inventing the wheel, because this is a sector which has been shown by our good friend Goodman and others from the UNHCR. The system is there. I mean, you don't have to beginning from scratch. Universities are there. They have their doors open, scholarships, etc., etc. All this is going on in Erasmus and in other places of the world. How can you have a coordinating committee putting on these 15,000 universities in the world, 5,000 working together? This is not difficult nowadays. And finding a financial facility. You saw the film, $1, £1, whatever it comes from. It's a sudden change. And I have an experience of a very small practice which shows that universities are prepared to receive these people. And what is most striking, if you find a way to evaluate their curricula, there's a way to do this. Many have documents, let me tell you. They are extremely good students. They want to go back. They want to have peace. Because when you have your father disappeared, your mother died, your cousin is somewhere not to be known, I mean, you have a challenge. And this is what all these experiences show, all those who have been dealing with this and to them. So thank you very much for this very inspiring moment. Now we have the tools and we have the paragraph.
Thank you, President Sampaio.
It was worthwhile having lost all sorts of minutes to have a paragraph. I'm happy with that.
Thank you, President Sampaio. And you have the ambitious goals as well. I believe you want to get to 1,000 students at the Global Platform for Syrian Refugees. You're currently on 150 in 10 countries. So I hope we are on track for all the refugees around the world. Thank you to all of our panelists for their thought-provoking interventions. And thank you very much indeed for being here as well. Thank you.